On behalf of our chapter leadership, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk by Frank Donoghue. Professor Donoghue is the author of The Last Professors, The Corporate University, and The Fate of the Humanities. The phrase corporate university may suggest some insidious, behind-the-scenes effort to undermine the values that we've come to associate with the American university. It is insidious, and I'm certain that a lot of plotting is going on behind the scenes, but of course, I'm of the generation that wondered for 30 years who shot JFK. The evidence of this phenomenon is, however, not hard to identify. In fact, it's everywhere around us. 4 or 5 days ago, when I was composing these introductory remarks, I culled the following 3 items from the news about higher education published in just that one day. First, Inside Higher Ed reported that Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, and Michigan have formed a consortium to offer free online courses, much as MIT and Stanford have already begun to do so. These courses will be entirely automated and free, unless, of course, one wishes to earn a certificate after completing 5 or 6 of them. In that case, one will have to go to a designated regional testing center and pay $800 or so to take a test that will certify whether or not you have mastered the material. Stanford's first offering, a basic course in computer science, has attracted almost 16,000 students that are taking it. Second, Inside Higher Ed also posted an article on a new robo-reader that can score English placement essays as effectively and consistently as human readers can. I am hardly a Luddite, and I would like to applaud these developments as imaginative technical advancements that will ultimately benefit both students and faculty. But I know that there are many administrators, trustees, business persons, and politicians out there who are regarding these developments as steps towards the total automation of the factory. Because to them, the university is nothing but a means of producing workers who can produce wealth modestly for themselves, but more prolifically for their employers, however many of them they may end up having over the course of their lifetimes. Lastly, on this same day, the Chronicle of Higher Education reported that Argosy University, now one of the largest providers of for-profit online education, had suffered an unexpected decline in enrollment. To protect the dividends paid to their stockholders, the corporate heads abruptly slashed the salaries of the faculty, almost all of whom are adjuncts, by 30 to 40%, depending on their disciplines. So much for the notion that faculty are professionals and that depending on a legally binding contract is beneath the dignity of professionals. But Professor Donoghue knows much more about these issues than I do. Let me provide a few words about his very accomplished professional background. He received his BA from Brandeis University and his MA and his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He's a professor of English at Ohio State University. His area of literary specialty is the 18th century British novel, and his publications in that area include the book The Fame Machine, Book Reviewing in the 18th Century and 18th Century Literary Careers. Published by Stanford University Press, it was selected by choice as an outstanding academic book of 1996. In addition to his book, The Last Professors, Professor Donoghue has contributed 10 articles on the current issues facing academia to leading academic journals and to several essay collections. He's been an invited or keynote speaker on the topic of higher education at 24 conferences and university-sponsored symposia, including the annual convention of the American Association of University Presses in 2011 and the annual convention of the Modern Language Association in 2012. Of all the utilitarian, anti-intellectual views of the university that Professor Donoghue highlights and dissects in his book, The Last Professors, the one that has resonated the most personally with me was uttered by Richard Teller Crane. an industrialist whose company, I believe in the book says, is still on the S&P 500, who argued in the early 1900s that, quote, "No man who has a taste for literature has the right to be happy." One sunny afternoon, back when I was in college, a business major friend of mine declared, entirely out of the blue, that in his opinion, reading fiction was little more than mental masturbation. After a lifetime of reading fiction, I do have to admit that my eyesight has been deteriorating, albeit very gradually. I have no idea what my business major friend is now doing, but UPS just delivered John Sayles' newest novel, A Moment in the Sun, to my doorstep. Some of you may know Sayles as an accomplished independent filmmaker. He made Matawan, for instance. He's also a very accomplished short story writer and novelist, in fact, one of my favorite writers. Amid all of his film projects, I have no idea how he has found time to write this 989-page novel. But I have begun reading it with all the frenzied, obsessive rapture of one of those disgusting monkeys at the zoo. To hook back to the earlier joke, Professor Donoghue, in case you're worried about that line being the segue to your talk, and really, who could blame you? I'll end on this observation instead. One of the invaluable things that modernist and postmodernist literature has to teach us is that dark laughter may be our last soul-saving option in the face of our extinction. Please give a warm round of applause, warm welcome to President Frank Donoghue, Professor Frank Donoghue.
Well, thanks, Marty, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'll do my best not to behave like a frenzied monkey. Well, here's what I have to say. Though I still speak as a humanist, I've expanded the scope of my talk since I submitted the tentative title to Marty a few weeks ago. As my new title, and here it is, it's different from the one that's on the poster. My new title is A Progressive History of the United States, of U.S. Higher Education, Shot Full of Holes, suggests. This will be a you're up, you're down story of the history of American academia. My hope is that this expansion will appeal to the broader audience that Marty has invited to attend tonight's talk. To me, the most important starting point is to recognize that higher ed in the United States is not a single social institution, but rather has been a variety of institutions for more than a century. And so the history of this elaborately stratified assortment of colleges and universities that make up post-secondary education in the country is crucial to understanding its present condition and to contextualizing all of its disciplines. Much of this information and history may be familiar to you, but I hope the review will be valuable. In my remarks tonight, I will look at 4 landmarks of America's higher education, past, before moving on to assess its ideological, political, and social present. Until the American Civil War, colleges in the country were essentially one entity. They shared a uniform curriculum with heavy emphasis on classical languages. They were very small. They catered exclusively to a wealthy male clientele that mainly aspired to careers as clergymen. For example, during the presidency of John Leverett, from 1708 to 1724, Harvard University graduated just 531 students, more than half of whom went on to careers in the clergy. That was typical of colleges before the Civil War. The Civil War changed the landscape dramatically and permanently by introducing and later establishing an entirely new and different kind of college, which then coexisted with the traditional colleges such as Harvard and Princeton. The circumstances of this development have largely receded from public memory, but are fascinating and well worth recounting. It all began with a bill proposed in 1857 by Justin Morrill, a congressman from Vermont. The bill called for the federal government to create a public land-grant university in every state that would specialize in the teaching of agricultural and mechanical sciences. That is, these new colleges would offer a fundamentally different, occupationally oriented curriculum than those already in existence, something very different, in other words, from the classical curriculum and extremely forward-looking. American higher education was ripe for such an idea, and though throughout his career, Morrill claimed exclusive credit for the principles of the Morrill Act, he was not alone in believing that it was time for a change. Unfortunately, the timing of the bill was bad. This is 1857. The southern states, wary of any federal government encroachment on their autonomy, opposed the idea. They were led by Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, and they had a point. The South had prestigious state universities which had existed for decades, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia. Why did they need more? So, while the bill narrowly passed both the House of Representatives and the Senate, President Buchanan vetoed it in the interest of appeasing the South and preserving national harmony. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, however, the educational climate changed overnight. Now a senator, Morrill reintroduced the bill to an all-Northern Congress and shrewdly added a provision that the land-grant university should also teach military sciences as well. There was an urgent point to this addition. Several of the best-trained generals and military engineers educated either at the National Military Academy at West Point or at the U.S.'s two other military colleges, Virginia Military Institute and the Citadel, both located in the South, chose to fight for the newly formed Confederate States of America. Stonewall Jackson, to cite a high-profile example, resigned his position of artillery studies at VMI to become an officer for the Army of Virginia. Even though they were outnumbered, the Confederate Army won all the early major battles in the war, chiefly, as most military historians agree, because they outgeneraled the North. In other words, the Union experienced a brain drain, an acute brain drain, and thus felt the sudden need to replenish its officer class. The new Morrill Act passed overwhelmingly and was signed into law by the newly elected President Lincoln in 1862. Thus, a new species of college was born. Of course, no one in 1862 could have imagined the scale or the duration of the Civil War, so Morrill's practical universities existed only in theory until the late 1860s and 1870s. When they did take shape, though, they became, in a matter of a few generations, the backbone of U.S. higher education. And among four-year universities, they remain so today. Not to say that there weren't bumps in the road, the most prominent and sometimes embarrassing of which was the lack of appropriate faculty. There simply weren't enough people who knew agriculture and engineering and also had something resembling teaching credentials. Most of the faculty were, in fact, leftovers from the old classical colleges. One example, which I find really hilarious, a professor charged with teaching Introduction to Farming at Michigan State, which was then called Michigan Agricultural College, held a degree in divinity and conducted his course by reading aloud, class after class, from a textbook on botany. After presumably boring his farming-savvy students, who must have wondered why on earth they were paying $25 a year in tuition, the professor resigned in profound despair after just 2 years. So this was part of the problem. It was an idea, in other words, the land-grant universities were, an idea that was far ahead of its time. But eventually, the institutions and the faculty caught up with the needs of their students. Now, land-grant universities currently educate 4.7 million of the 18 million college students in the country, and they have had 20 million alumni over the years. More subtle but significant changes altered the landscape of U.S. higher education in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and this, I think, is a useful digression, further disintegrating the classical curriculum. First, the Civil War decimated the country's male college-age population, so it's at least possible to speculate that coeducational higher education would have been much slower to materialize if it weren't for the Civil War. Ohio State was co-ed from its inception in 1870. As were most of the other land-grant universities. Second, the free elective curriculum that we all know today, where you have requirements and also electives, was certainly helped along by the rise of the land-grant universities, but it was also spearheaded by the educational philosophies of two extremely influential college presidents, and the creation of yet another kind of institution of higher learning, the research university. All these developments happened at the same time in the 1860s, late 1860s and early 1870s. My colleague Elizabeth Renker, a noted historian of American higher education, describes the transformation concisely, and I have a quote from her book, American Literature Becomes Knowledge. She says, 3 institutions in particular best emblematize the growing cultural pressures that forced the classical curriculum's demise. First, the new Cornell University, opened in 1868, as in benefactor Ezra Cornell's famous words, an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. Second, President Charles William Eliot became president of Harvard University in 1869 and inaugurated the elective system there. Cornell and Harvard embodied the distinction between vocational and liberal higher education, yet these otherwise competing institutions nevertheless united in legitimizing the idea of a broader curriculum. In so doing, they challenged and in fact demolished the curricular criteria and the traditional classical colleges. Third, the Johns Hopkins University opened in 1876, redefining higher education as a form of advanced scientific expertise. With its ideological and material focus on hiring faculty who are expert scholars, on producing published research, and on training PhD students, Hopkins operated in a manner wholly independent of the antebellum collegiate model. While the free elective curriculum retained a set of required courses, it gave students a chance to specialize in subjects that interested them most. It would be far too presentist to say that this development, far less dramatic, I think, than the adoption of the Morrill land grant, marked the first step in the consumerization of U.S. higher education, which continues today. It is now, however, customary for university administrators to describe students as customers, since the free elective curriculum does give them great latitude in deciding what to study and what not to study. To take one dramatic example, at Yale University in 1907, 98% of all students had a prior knowledge of Greek. By 1927, just 14 years later, less than 50% of Yale freshmen came to college with some knowledge of Greek. This is a sign that the classical curriculum was breaking down and the free elective curriculum was taking over. So by 1921, 50% of Yale freshmen came to college with some knowledge of Greek, and once there, only 8% chose to continue studying it. The swift decline in the popularity of Greek was a direct consequence of Yale's adoption of the free elective curriculum. Once students were no longer obliged to study Greek, they chose in great numbers not to. So this is one thing, the Morrill Act and these other phenomenon that happened all at around the same time in the late 1860s and early 1870s that changed the face of American higher education. Fast forward nearly 100 years to landmark number 2. The next seismic shift in higher education came in 1944, when in the waning months of World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly referred to as the GI Bill of Rights. One of its central provisions was a higher education voucher system for military personnel who had served in the war. The GI Bill enabled an entire generation of Americans to attend college at government expense. The vast majority of these returning students, or sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines, would otherwise never have been able to afford to go to college. Thus, in just a few years, the demographic shape of the American college student population was radically altered and expanded. 78% of returning veterans, in other words, 12.4 million men and women, took advantage of the bill. Spikes in university enrollments were spectacular. Just 2 examples. In 1945, Purdue University enrolled 5,600 students. In 1946, it enrolled 11,500. Syracuse University enrolled 4,400 students in 1945. In 1946, it enrolled 15,200. Colleges throughout the country expanded their facilities at breakneck speed and scrambled to find competent faculty, finding high school teachers with MAs willing to moonlight and staff night courses, And I think even more importantly, universities began hiring Jewish intellectuals and eventually women, heretofore effectually banned from academia. So the seismic shift is not just restricted to students, it also expands to include faculty. Before World War II, American colleges and universities were a province for the wealthy. Even though the land-grant universities were quite inexpensive, the 4 years of time invested in attending them, as opposed to working full-time, made them unattractive to the poor. The GI Bill changed all that. Since all returning benefits could benefit from the tuition voucher, the population of colleges suddenly came from a whole range of the U.S.'s socioeconomic classes, and those new students came to aspire to professional careers rather than to trades. It should be noted that there was resistance to the GI Bill. And this, I think, was a really fascinating thread of the story. Harold Stoke, president of the University of New Hampshire, immediately recognized it as a potential entitlement, worrying that the GI Bill was, quote, unwittingly imposed compulsory higher education on the nation, unquote. James Conant Bryant, president of Harvard, concerned that not everyone was suited for college, argued for a revised GI Bill that would restrict access to college to a carefully selected group. And then most vehemently, Robert Maynard Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago, argued that veterans would attend college on the GI Bill only because they couldn't find jobs. And he worried that thereby colleges would be turned into, quote, educational hobo jungles, unquote. His words, and this is a guy who is very prominent as a speaker and writer about higher education. In the end, though, it's not an exaggeration to say that the GI Bill created the American middle class by giving so many citizens a chance to earn a college degree and thus gain access to the professions. Its effect lasted for generations after its passage, though, as well, since the beneficiaries of the GI Bill quite naturally assumed that their sons and daughters would attend college as well, thus turning a college education into a widespread expectation. I know this from personal experience. My father benefited from the GI Bill, never would have been able to attend college without it, and as a result, he sure as well expected that myself and my 3 siblings would go to college. So it had almost a geometric effect. Anybody who went to college on the GI Bill expected their kids to go to college too. Hence, we have 18 million students enrolled in college. That expectation, along with the country's growing population, gave rise to yet another institution of higher learning, the community college, landmark number 3. 2-year colleges that specialize in general education, lower division courses, and occupation-oriented training have existed in the U.S. since the turn of the 20th century, but mushroomed in the post-World War II era and continue to expand today. For example, between 1963 and 2006, enrollment at community colleges increased by 741%. They now enroll nearly 7 million students, or more than a third of the country's overall enrollment, college enrollment. In comparison, just to put it in some kind of context, the enrollment for public 4-year colleges and universities during that same period increased by 197%, while the enrollment for private 4-year colleges and universities increased by 170%. So college enrollment's going up everywhere, but going up by a multiple of 5 at community colleges. Why have 2-year community colleges soared in popularity? Most fundamentally, they're affordable. Average tuition at community colleges is $2,510 per year, as compared to 4-year private colleges and universities, where the average tuition is $26,515. They are also a uniquely American institution. In their comprehensive history of community colleges, Arthur Cohen and Florence Brewer point out that, quote, other developed nations, especially those in Western Europe, from which most of the American ideas of education were imported, did not develop community colleges of their own. They all faced the same phenomenon of rising populations, changing technologies, different expectations for child rearing, and a shifting pattern of preparation for the workforce. However, they built adult education centers, like Britain's Open University, for example, and vocational schools separate which proliferate in Germany, separate from each other and rarely founded institutions that would enable people to transfer credit from community colleges to baccalaureate programs. There's a certain idealistic sense of egalitarianism that underwrites the concept of the community college, a notion that every U.S. citizen should have affordable access to some form of post-secondary education. Thus, there are currently more than 1,100 community colleges in the U.S., along with tuition tax credits that make them accessible to almost any high school graduate. You can get a tuition tax credit for $2,000 to attend college. That all but pays for most of the tuition at community colleges anywhere in the country. The final and newest kind of American institution, this is landmark number 4 of higher learning, is the for-profit university. Pioneered by the University of Phoenix, which was founded in 1994, for-profit colleges and universities are both the most unique post-secondary schools and also represent the fastest growing sector in higher education. There are currently more than 2,400 for-profit colleges and universities in the country. Some are gigantic. The University of Phoenix enrolls nearly 500,000 students. Most are much smaller, but the group as a whole enrolls 13% of the country's post-secondary students. And enrollments increased 25% in 2009. They are, in other words, quickly gaining ground on community colleges and traditional four-year colleges and universities. 2 features in particular distinguish for-profits from other universities. The first is obvious. They are businesses, organized to educate students to be sure, but to make a profit as well. Several are publicly traded. The University of Phoenix, for example, trades as Apollo Group on the NASDAQ stock exchange and has a market cap of $6 billion. Strayer Education, which I can see from the window of my hotel, has a market cap of nearly $2 billion, on one of its campuses I can see. Some of the larger for-profits franchise extensively and have campuses in several countries. A second distinguishing feature is that for-profits, the University of Phoenix as the front runner, rely heavily on online learning. The University of Phoenix invented online learning. Even before there was the internet, they invented it via email. This is the biggest driver in their exponential expansion because online learning doesn't require a physical campus. All the teaching is done via computer. The number of students it can accommodate can expand almost without limits, simply because proximity to a campus ceases to be an issue. Thus, a student in rural Ohio can take online courses at Walden University, a large for-profit headquartered in Minnesota, even though he or she lives several states away. The expansion of for-profits can be quite dramatic. Ashford University, a near-bankrupt college run by a group of Franciscan nuns in rural Iowa, has mushroomed from fewer than 400 students in 2005, when it was a traditional college, to more than 76,000 students at the end of last year, after the Iowa school was purchased by a San Diego corporation, Bridgepoint Education, a publicly traded for-profit education company with a market cap of $900 million. Moreover, the for-profit model, with its emphasis on convenience, its practical occupation-oriented curriculum, and its heavy reliance on online instruction, has had a tremendous influence on traditional colleges as well. The Sloan Corporation offers the following evidence. For the past 6 years, online enrollments have been growing substantially faster than overall higher education enrollments at all institutions. Online enrollments have continued to grow at rates far in excess of total higher education student population, with the most recent data demonstrating no signs of slowing, and they offer several bullet points backing this up. Over 4.6 million students were taking at least one online course during the fall 2008 term, a 17% increase over the number reported the previous year. Second point, the 17% growth rate for online enrollments far exceeds the 1.2% growth for the overall higher education student population. And then finally, more than 1 in 4 college and university students now take at least one online course. Thus concludes a brief account of the complexity of higher education as a social institution in the United States. It's best described as a palimpsest, determined by historical events and financial considerations. of all the kinds of institutions I have described, all the kinds of institutions I have described continue to coexist, and students contemplating a college education have a wide variety of choices. The central question to ask now is, what is the current state of higher education in the country? The answer, I believe, unfortunately, is that it is in steady decline. And I will devote the remainder of my remarks to trying to explain why. I would state the central reason as follows. The United States is still a young country, and we as a people have from the beginning been far more interested in all things pecuniary than in learning. Two legendary American sociologists put it best quite a while ago. Thorstein Veblen, in his classic study, The Higher Learning in America, which was published in 1916, constantly alludes to the tendency of the American public to adduce business success as evidence of the wisdom in all areas, including academia, when in fact the guiding principles of good business, competition, efficiency, productivity, have little or no place in the world of higher learning. Universities, Veblen argues, should always be a place of refuge, a place of meeting, confluence, and dissemination for those ideas that live and move and have their being in the higher learning. That's his idea of what a university should be. 50 years later, Richard Hofstadter, in his book Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, makes the same case in different terms. He claims that, quote, "It has been the fate of American higher education to develop in a preeminently business-like culture with a shallow base of cultural traditions." And that, quote, "Americans have shown an intense, almost touching faith in both the personal and civic uses of education, but this faith has not been accompanied by an equally profound understanding of the cultural content of education," unquote. I have argued in The Last Professors that the corporate world and the world of higher education have been at odds with each other for more than a century. The reason for the decline I describe in higher education is that the corporate interests, always standing in the good graces of the American public, have always been suspicious of the value of education and have steadily encroached on the interests of higher learning to the point where it is now possible to characterize all American colleges and universities as businesses. There is no better instance of this encroachment than the for-profit college industry, which I have just described. That industry, more than any other sector of higher education, of the higher education system, has to make day-to-day decisions about which is more important, making money or educating students. And I think Marty's introductory story about which university was it that cut its faculty salaries by 30%? Argosy, right. That's a perfect example. Unfortunately, it's typical. Most for-profit universities consistently choose the former, consistently choose the notion that their business decisions are more important than their educational decisions. The last example from my first section illustrates that tendency perfectly. Bridgepoint Education, which rescued the struggling college in Iowa and increased its enrollment from 400 to 78,000 in just 4 years, might, at first glance, seem to have made a huge positive contribution to society by giving so many people access to a college education. The problem, though, is that Bridgepoint has an astonishingly low graduation rate of 1.2%. Thus, only a tiny fraction of those 78,000 will reap any benefits from attending. And Bridgepoint is hardly alone. The University of Phoenix, with its enrollment of nearly 500,000, graduates only 9%. Under the administration of President Obama, these alarming numbers have come under scrutiny from the government, especially the Government Accountability Office, and have been the subject of hearings in the Senate. The enrollments of for-profits are actually down in the last couple of years as a result of this scrutiny. But it's too soon to tell if this is a permanent trend. The findings consistently illustrate the same problem over and over. The business interests of the for-profit colleges and universities always outweigh their purported educational mission. How this works in practice is simple. The more students these institutions enroll, the more revenue they bring in for themselves and their shareholders. Admission standards are thus typically ridiculously low, and I can tell you anecdotes about this which will boggle your mind, and many students are lured to enroll by highly questionable recruiting practices. For example, and this is part of what the Government Accountability Office has been doing in the past couple of years. For example, an undercover investigator for the GAO reported that a recruiter, the undercover operator, went in pretending to be a prospective student and so dealt with a recruiter from a for-profit university, reported that this recruiter, attempting to get him to enroll at a for-profit college that had a hairstyling program, told the undercover agent that barbers make between $150,000 and $200,000 per year. Actually, according to the Center for Business Statistics, the average barber's salary is in fact $43,000 a year. Once the students are enrolled, instructors are routinely told to inflate their grades, in other words, to keep them enrolled for as long as possible so that they continue to generate revenue. That's the way the game works. The source of that revenue is equally disturbing. As I mentioned earlier, for-profits enroll 13% of the nation's college population, but those students receive 37% of all federally funded student loans and grants. Thus, the least qualified college students in the country are being educated largely at taxpayer expense in the end. Moreover, they default on their student loans at 3 times the rate of students at traditional colleges and universities, which suggests that even those who graduate from for-profits fail to get jobs that pay well enough for them to be able to repay their student loans. So while in theory, for-profit universities do the country a service by providing millions of citizens access to higher education, there is mounting evidence that they do so in such unscrupulous ways that they are in fact doing harm to those students and to the country as well. If we move from the for-profit colleges and universities to the upper echelon of American higher education, we find disappointments of a different kind, but which also have to do with questions of access. The country's elite universities not only have reverted to their pre-Civil War status as havens for the wealthiest Americans, but they have also become expert at commodifying and marketing their own prestige. I am guided here by my assumptions that the American version of prestige, a subject which never ceases to fascinate me, is distinctive. It is not perceived as a natural quality or necessarily as an aspect of long-standing, time-honored traditions. Instead, it is integral to consumer culture. In our nation of aspirational shoppers, where purchases are often expressions of envy or anxiety about social status, prestige almost always manifests itself as the aura around any expensive commodity, a house, a car, a watch, a pair of shoes, or for my purposes, a college. Thus, though the concept of prestige may itself or may ideally be ineffable, the Americans who are conscious of prestige tend to want to assess it, put a price tag on it, brand it, and acquire it. It's a very different concept than traditional European notions of prestige. Thus, preoccupation with measuring prestige, in turn, leaves a host of traces which I can use to navigate the higher education system at the very top. Let me elaborate. Robert Frank, in a great essay called Higher Education, the Ultimate Winner-Take-All Game or Market, argues that in higher education, this is his argument, he argues that in higher education, market prestige ultimately transcends commodification. He contrasts admission to prestigious and thus necessarily highly selective colleges with another familiar luxury item manufactured by Porsche. And this is a quote from Frank. He says, when excess demand arises in the market for an ordinary private good or service, it is almost always fleeting. Thus, when Porsche introduced its new Boxster in 1996, each new delivery was sold out more than a year in advance. But anyone who really wanted this car could find one at a price. This is the distinction he's making between commodities in the real world and the way college works as a commodity. But then he says, not so in the upper reaches of the academic market. Despite the persistence of excess demand in this market, demand for a place in a college like Harvard or Princeton or Yale, universities continue to turn away qualified students while charging those they admit only about 1/3 of what it costs to serve them. But Frank is, I believe, wrong. While it is true that the size of the entering classes of the most competitive colleges and universities remains fixed regardless of the demand for admission, money figures far more importantly than Frank would care to admit. With enough money, the right connections, and an early start, one can buy one's way into the upper reaches of the academic market just as easily as one could have bought a Boxster in 1996 at a price. One could prepare to do so by going to an elite prep school, such as Phillips Andover, where tuition, room, and board for 2011-2012 was $42,350. By signing up for the Princeton Review's deluxe SAT preparation package, which guarantees an overall 200-point improvement in the test taker's overall score for $7,000. Such measures, while hardly routine, are becoming increasingly common and affordable only to the very rich. Samuel G. Friedman reports that the undergraduate test prep business now has revenue of $726 million per year, up 25% from just 4 years ago. Growing in popularity even faster is the admissions counseling business. The Independent Education Consultants Association, which represents private academic counselors, claims about 3,500 members, up 200 from only a decade ago, and about 100 more consultants apply for membership each month. These counselors charge an average of $3,300 for their services, tutoring, help with admissions essays, help with test taking, etc. But if money is no object, the consultant company Ivywise charges $10,000 to $30,000 to prepare your kid for college. Ivywise offers several levels of service for high schoolers, aiming for highly ranked colleges, the top of the line being the junior, senior platinum package. That would be the one that would cost 30 grand. The high-ranking universities also do their part in guaranteeing access to the very rich. And there have been a couple of great books written about this topic. Joseph Soares, in his book, The Power of Privilege, Yale and America's Elite Colleges, uses Yale's own data to show that 14% of the students attending in 2000 were legacies, that is, children of alumni. Daniel Golden, in his book, The Price of Admissions, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges and Who Gets Left Outside the Gates, looks at the benefits that accrue to Harvard's most generous donors and to the children of those who appear on the university's Z list. As Inside Higher Education reports, the university's Committee on University Resources is generally restricted to those who have given at least $1 million to Harvard. Of the 340 members who have children who have children who are either college age or past college age, 336 of the 340 are currently enrolled or have graduated from Harvard, even though the university admits fewer than 1 in 10 candidates overall. The Z list, which Harvard refuses to acknowledge in any official way, according to Golden, consists of 25 to 50, quote, well-connected but often academically borderline applicants who are told they can enroll if they defer for a year. These are children of billionaires and multimillionaires, people who are very likely to donate enormous amounts to Harvard if their kids get in. And all they're asked to do is the kid will get a deferral, be admitted within a year, and the money will flow from the parents. Thus, it's not the admission to a selective college. Thus, it's not that admission to a selective college transcends price and is thus prestigious in a unique way. Rather, the price, when one combines both the cost of preparation and 4 years' tuition, exceeds that of even the most expensive cars. If one reads between the lines of the university presidents who opposed the GI Bill, it becomes clear that they weren't worried about the numbers of students who would be entering college after the war. They were worried about the social classes from which those numbers would come. The current cost of prepping for and attending elite colleges ensures that the current and future presidents of Harvard and the University of Chicago will never have to worry about their institutions being transformed into educational hobo jungles. Finally, if we turn to the middle stratum of American colleges and universities, we find more evidence of decline, particularly in the public university system, for generations the most affordable four-year institutions in the country. As Ferris Womack and James Duderstadt put it, public universities are now beyond the crossroads. The reason? They are simply trying to do too many things with insufficient financial resources. They are being pushed to compete with community colleges and for-profits, which define themselves as proving grounds for the business community, and often readily applicable occupation-oriented training, as well as the convenience of online instruction. Public universities have been very slow to adopt the online model to any significant degree, falling behind community colleges, which have been very, very quick to follow the lead of the for-profits. Many community colleges now have extensive selection of online courses, and even the elite universities are using these kind of like quasi-online versions of their curriculum. The public universities just haven't done it. They just haven't gone that route. And the public universities are also, mistakenly in my opinion, trying to compete with the elite universities in the race for commodified prestige. Nothing better epitomizes that competition than the magazine U.S. News and World Report's annual issue ranking America's colleges and universities from the best to the worst. Public universities compete in these rankings, which, while controversial, are widely used as promotional material by a very large number of institutions, and they do so at a tremendous disadvantage compared to their private peers. They are inevitably poorer, and they are not selective, and selectivity and the academic quality of the student body are heavily weighted factors in the U.S. News formula. Without the option of rejecting more applicants than they admit, state universities must abandon any claim to exclusivity and thus forego any dream of reaching the apex of the prestige scale in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And I can't ever resist this example. In an open letter from Karen Holbrook, who was then president of Ohio State, to alumni and friends of the university, she tried to put a happy face on this predestination. This was in 2007. She announced, quote, "I am pleased to report to you that U.S. News and World Report's 2007 edition of America's Best Colleges, released today, ranks Ohio State among the nation's top 20 public universities. We made a significant move from 21st to a tie for 19th. Among all universities, public and private, Ohio State moved up from 60th to 57th. Holbrook's phrasing drives home the pathetic nature of the claims. She herself separates private from public universities so as not to emphasize that Ohio State has moved up to 57th among all universities, and she characterizes the move from 21st to co-equal 19th as significant. Reading the letter immediately sets one to the challenging task of naming all the universities that rank above Ohio State, and I'm sure that was not her intention. The vast majority of these, of course, are private, smaller, and thus in a position to be selective. The Princeton Review also ranks America's colleges, rating them on a scale from 60 to 100. 100 is the highest score you can achieve. 60 is contemptuously assigned to any school that refuses to divulge its data. Of the 101 universities that receive scores of 97 or higher, only 14 are public in the most recent survey. Most centrally, the individual states have largely abandoned their commitment to funding public education. Duderstadt, who was president of the University of Michigan from 1988 to 1996, once quipped that during his tenure in office, his university went from being state-supported to state-assisted to state-located. He's correct. The state of Michigan currently pays 12% of its university's budget. Ohio contributes just 10% to Ohio State University's budget. The defunding of public universities hits the land-grant universities with which I began my essay hardest. A sad irony, since that network of schools for generations has served as so crucial to American higher education. They held that position largely because they were affordable and thus guaranteed access to college to millions of citizens. But that only happened because states supported them, and now they don't. The widespread withdrawal of the state support for these universities has inevitably meant large increases in tuition. Tuition at public universities has actually spiked more dramatically in the first 10 years of this decade than tuition at private universities. A few examples. From 2004 to 2006, tuition at the University of Arizona rose 24%, 30% at the University of Kentucky, 32% at the University of Colorado. That eclipses even the tuition hikes at private universities. As this trend continues, fewer and fewer Americans will be able to attend college, or will attend only because they choose to borrow enormous amounts of money to pay for the rising tuitions. Or they will attend community colleges, still a conundrum in my assessment of higher education in greater and greater numbers. I really don't know how to place community colleges in my map of this whole arena. New numbers from the United States Department of Education show that federal student loan disbursements, the total amount borrowed by students and received by schools, in the 2008-2009 academic year grew about 25% over the previous year to $75.1 billion. The amount of money students borrow has long been on the rise, but the last year far surpassed increases, which ranged from as low as 1.7% in the 1998-99 school year to almost 17% in 1994-95. Access to higher education in the U.S. is unquestionably more complicated than it has been since the early 20th century, when only the affluent attended colleges. Middle-class students must make a terrible choice: either not attend college and thus place themselves at a huge disadvantage in a global knowledge-based economy, or take on crushing amounts of debt to attend, a decision that inevitably has lifelong consequences. What conclusions can we draw, and what recommendations can we suggest about this dire situation? For politicians and students alike in the U.S., it all comes down to a single fundamental question. Should higher education be a social entitlement, just as the first 12 grades of education are in this country? The answer, I believe, is very discouraging. If nothing changes, that is, if the United States budget and tax code are not fundamentally reformed, then the country will simply not be able to fund higher education for everyone. Perhaps no developed country misuses its money as ridiculously as the United States does. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Chris Hedges argues eloquently in his book Empire of Illusion that the United States military spending is misguided and bloated, dwarfing that of any other country in the world. Carrie Nelson, president of the American Association of University Professors, at least for the time being, has speculated that if the U.S. eliminated just three of its weapon systems that are currently operating as a deterrent against attacks from the Soviet Union, the federal government could make public higher education free for everyone. Another problem is the way the United States taxes its population, a topic finally getting intense political scrutiny on a national scale. The simple fact, of course, is that the country's overall tax system is severely biased in favor of the very wealthy, the people who can afford to send their children to the most expensive universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, without even the benefits of financial aid. If the wealthy paid their fair share of income taxes, that might free money to assist the parents of the poor and the middle class in their efforts to finance their children's higher education. But it's uncertain whether the mood of the country seems in favor of or opposed to such a move. The Ryan budget, as we all know, would cut the top income tax rate for the wealthy and would also cut federal education grants to the poorest students. So the revenue available to the lower and middle classes for higher education would be reduced even further. What if we raised the possibility that access to college should not be an entitlement? That is, should all U.S. high school graduates be allowed to enroll in public universities, regardless of their academic ability or desire to learn? An increasing number of conservative higher education experts, led by sociologists Jackson Tobey and Richard Vedder, are saying no. And this is really interesting. The conservative attack on higher education is no longer about the culture wars. It's all about money. And it's coming mostly from Vedder and from Toby and from a few other people. Santorum's attempt to resurrect the culture wars during his campaign was really a kind of aberration. That's not what conservatives are saying about higher education now. Jackson Toby makes the case most emphatically in his recent book, The Lowering of Higher Education in America, Why Financial Aid Should Be Based on Student Promise. He claims that, quote, prepared or not, youngsters hear that they ought to go to college for their own good, and persuaded by adults, the majority of high school graduates apply regardless of their enthusiasm for further education, unquote. Then, quote, having convinced high school graduates to enroll in college, we make it easy for almost any high school graduates to get accepted at some college and pleasant for them when they get there, unquote. Finally, he outlines the financial implications of universal higher education. They would be extremely precarious. Because of the price of college, students would finance their educations, most commonly by borrowing money. This is already a problem. Toby echoes the point that the country's collective student debt now exceeds $1 trillion, more than the country's collective credit card debt. Toby's solution? Essentially, to tie a given student's financial aid and even access to college to that student's academic promise and performance is, in my opinion, uncomfortable. But in the end, it might be inevitable. Barring any radical changes like the ones I've outlined above, our country's economy simply cannot sustain the cost of universal higher education. Yet Toby's solution would also reintroduce the notion that college should be a haven for the wealthiest American youth. Toby essentially envisions a meritocracy, a system in which the best students get access to higher education. But as Michael Young pointed out in his brilliant satire, The Rise of the Meritocracy, a book largely forgotten now, published in 1958, meritocracies inevitably evolve over time into oligarchies. That's already a tendency in American higher education, and Toby's proposed reform would only accelerate it. That is, most academically promising students would likely come from the country's richest families in the first place, as they would have the best academic preparation before even reaching college age. Like it or not, the economically regressive changes outlined by Toby are, as I've said, quite possibly inevitable. If U.S. higher education trends in the direction that Toby advocates, it will come to mirror the systems of China and India. Everyone would agree that all developed and developing nations compete in what is usually described as a global knowledge economy. China and India have essentially made a wager that they can compete in that economy by rigorously training only a fraction of their college-age population. If you look outside of the eastern rim of China, you don't find people who are really being college educated. China is focusing its educational, most rigorous educational training on a very small percentage of its college-age population. By contrast, access to higher education in the U.S. has consistently expanded since the 1870s. Now, though, further expansion seems financially unsustainable, and it may be time to re-examine that egalitarian pattern. Might we make the same kind of wager that China and India have made? It would be riskier for the United States because our population is far smaller than either of those countries. We need, if at all possible, to make the best use of our significantly smaller numbers of human resources. I predict that this will be the central debate about U.S. higher education as we move further into the 21st century. Do we continue to expand higher education in whatever form, at whatever expense, or do we concentrate the resources that we devote to higher education on training the best and brightest? And if so, how do we identify them? At what age? And what do we do about it? Only time will tell what the country will do and what the consequences will be. Thank you.
We have questions? I'll make a comment, you can comment on it.
Sure.
It seems to me that what you're talking about in the conservative right-wing kind of response to the issue is is sort of a version of this accuse and do. So in other words, we cut support for higher education while we're devoting those monies to other things.
Right.
Then we say that the price of tuition is unsustainable. And then we say that the way to solve the problem is to restrict access
Right.
to the elite people on our side of the ledger, basically. So it seems to me as much of a political agenda as it seems an economic reality.
Yes, I think it is, and I think it's interesting that Toby's book and much of Richard Vedder's writing, he teaches at Ohio University, so I get to talk to him and correspond with him quite a bit. They don't go near describing the full picture. In other words, they don't go near the fact that the rich are being taxed at minuscule rates, nowhere near the top marginal income tax rate for the rich is at an all-time low. They don't talk about where the revenue could come from outside of education itself. They just treat the higher education world as like its own terrarium. They say, okay, if we cut administration, if we raise teaching loads, then we can save money for students. And if we also just eliminate financial aid, get the government out of the higher education business altogether, if we tie financial aid to student performance and promise, then we will have a much better student body. That's leaving a lot of the larger context out of the picture, and that's my beef with their argument. But at the same time, they are making some valid points. I mean, especially when you look at the performances of people in for-profit universities, a lot of those people are really not qualified to be in college, and yet they're the ones that are getting the vast amount, or a disproportionate amount, rather, of guaranteed federal loans. And if they default on them, which they do in record numbers, 3 times the rate of students at public universities, then taxpayers pick up the tab. So it's, in some ways, there are parts of their arguments that are persuasive.
But the people who push the for-profits are the right. Just kind of
I know.
People,
yes, it is, right.
The Republicans who voted for Bush and all, the whole package, they'll pick and choose what they want, cherry pick what they want, will say, well, that's not really Republicanism. Ideally, this is the way it should work. But the same people that are pushing for the charter schools are the same people that are behind all the for-profit universities. And originally, the for-profits had a 70% cap on the amount of revenue that could come from federal sources. It's now 90%.
Right.
And Apollo that you mentioned gets 89% of their revenue from federal loans. So there's a clear, awareness that they're exploiting people that are marginally eligible, and they're in the process they're driving up rates on student loans and making the pool of money that's available to other students who are more eligible much narrower.
That's right, and more expensive.
Yes.
Yeah. That's definitely true. The for-profit industry just flourished during the Bush administration, and their lobbyists contribute overwhelmingly to the Republican Party. So, that's part of the issue, I think. Yes?
I have 2 questions. One is Vedder the same guy who was sort of talking about how, we need to save money by not having the fact that people do this ridiculous spending time doing this ridiculous stuff like research, and spend more time generating a product that we're selling, kind of thing.
Yes.
And I guess one of the things I wonder about that, if we're going to save research for the elite institutions to do, then does that also, it seems to me that also shifts the kind of research that one does, because only the elites get to do research, get to decide what gets researched, and so on and so forth. And related to that question, in your sort of story about the evolution of higher education, it seemed to me that there's a piece missing there from the 1960s, where you started having a real push towards education about topics that were otherwise neglected, and so the kind of thing like what Arizona just outlawed Mexican American studies, for example. And I wonder how that
Yeah, there are other chapters that I could certainly have included. I think you can, if you want to do a timeline of a word that I hate now that Facebook switched over to it, forced it on all of us, but if you want to do a timeline of American higher education, I would say that 1965 was the apex of progressive legislation in American higher education. You get to 1965, that's the year that Pell Grants were invented and passed into law. That's the year that Stafford loans, really low interest student loans, were passed into law. Since then, almost all legislation affecting higher education has been regressive, and it continues to be. And I think that what's going on now is a sign of that. Vetter is also one of the people who argues that most research is a waste of time, and that's another hobby horse for conservative critics of higher education. They say that, well, professors are freed up to spend so much of their time doing research, and if you really look at the numbers, most of that research is never cited. You know, there's a huge controversy right now about citationality, about how much of the research that professors do is actually getting read and cited. There's a very controversial piece that Mark Bauerlein wrote, a report that he wrote, that drew a lot of heat, where he's saying basically that the average academic monograph sells 250 copies, 200 to libraries, 50 to individuals, and of the 200 copies that get sold to libraries, those monographs get checked out an average of twice a year. So he's saying if you're giving somebody basically 4 months off out of the year to do that kind of writing, and nobody's reading it, and that academic research consists of a whole bunch of people who are required to produce in order to have the credentials to get tenure and promotion, but nobody's required to be a consumer, then maybe we need to change the model in such a way that those people are in the classroom more. And if we did that, then college would be less expensive because teachers would be in the classroom more. I don't know how I feel about that exactly. I think that I do think that the whole reward system for faculty it needs to be reformed desperately, but I'm not sure quite how, and I'm not sure where it would start.
You have a line in your book, though, where you say that it's ironic that at the point where the whole reward system is being attacked, the number of people who actually are on a tenure track and involved in that system is declining.
Yes, that's true.
So it's like the attack is escalating as the target is shrinking.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yes.
Based on anti-war publication, ridiculously high percentage of our tax
Goes to.
is that true?
Military purposes.
Yes. Right. Right.
50% is
Mm-hmm.
And the second question, that may not be that high, but what happened at this point, we are talking lots of budget cuts, but no one is really talking. Is there any reason why we cannot talk about that?
Any reason we can't talk about
Debt.
debt? Well, I think.
Why we don't talk about cutting?
Well, cutting the military. Well, I think that's a conversation that's on the table. At least that's what Obama's promoting, at least as part of his campaign. And Romney wants to increase the military budget beyond what the Pentagon wants. So, you know, you have a huge discrepancy in their positions. We'll see how it plays out. But I think that, you know, the United States military budget dwarfs that of any other country in the world. And you redirect some of that money towards education, and big changes happen. I just hate to see the United States defunding education from a federal level. And what's happened to state universities especially has been really tragic. And I think that it's been compounded by state universities, especially the flagship universities. I see this all the time. I've been at Ohio State for 23 years now, and I've just seen it be sucked into this competition race for prestige and for this desire to be seen as a major research university on par with Princeton and Harvard and Yale. They can't do it because their original mission was to educate the state's population. And if they're bent on being selective, they can't do that. Plus, they just don't have the money. They don't have the donors. They don't have the endowment. And so they'll never be able to do that. And so for them to be drawn into that race and then at the same time feel like, well, oh, we also have to be kind of hands-on and compete with community colleges and other kind of institutions that do practical instruction, they've lost their sense of direction. And I think that can be said of a lot of state universities, that they're trying to do too many things and failing as a result.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of build on that point. One of the things most of us struggle with are, not, we're unhappy with the legislature kind of defunding us, but our administrations make these foolish decisions about how to spend money in
Yes.
institutions. At University of Cincinnati, where I'm at, we spend an enormous amount of money on things that have nothing to do with education.
Right.
In the midst of all these budget crunches that we're all facing, we built a $16 million indoor practice field for
Yes.
the football team.
Right. Yeah, that's
All these expenses that have nothing to do with construction.
right. That's the same thing has happened at a lot of places. AAUP-WSU had they made news 5 years ago when they built the largest dormitory in the country. This is a poor university. Imagine how far that would have gone in the form of classroom instruction. Ohio State recently built a brand new student union, a state-of-the-art student athletic center. It's almost like it can't be a university unless you have a climbing wall anymore. I don't know why. Refurbish the library and make it look absolutely lavish. This has been going on forever. There's a great anecdote from Thorstein Veblen's The Higher Learning in America, in which he talks about how much, he has a whole chapter on how much universities value physical plant over anything else, including instruction. And he talks about Stanford building a state-of-the-art chemistry building. And this is in like 1907. His book is wonderful if you haven't read it. It's a kind of hidden gem. He intended to publish it posthumously because it's so inflammatory. But then he decided that after the president of the last university where he worked died, that he would just go ahead and publish it anyway, and he did. But he worked at Stanford for a while. And he has this anecdote about how Stanford built this state-of-the-art, lavish chemistry building that looked beautiful from the outside. But they went on the cheap when they decided to build the ventilation system. So the chemists were gassing themselves on a daily basis. Nobody died, but the building looked beautiful. They just didn't care about what went on in the chemistry labs where the students were being instructed and suffocated at the same time. They just cared about how good the building looked. So classroom instruction always comes in dead last in the priorities for universities. Administrators do weird things when they get money. They want to make the university look beautiful, so it attracts students, I think. But then what goes on after the students are there, whether it's a gas chamber or whatever, it just doesn't seem to really matter. And this goes on, I see it at Ohio State too. I think it's a phenomenon of universities everywhere. And Veblen identified it, to his credit, in 1916. So it's not a new phenomenon. But the more we, when we're emerging out of a horrible recession, I think that's when we really notice it as being money poorly spent. And money, we can more easily envision ways that it could be much better spent. But yeah, it's a great point. Yes?
Yeah, we're talking about it as a business model, essentially, and I was wondering, the NCAA, as far as sports goes, I feel is probably one of the biggest marketing ways that them to distribute the name, brand themselves.
Right.
How do you feel that fits into the argument of the whole education system?
That's a really tricky question, I think, because I can move back to the microphone if you can't hear me. It's a really tricky question. It depends on the nature of the institution. At Division II and Division III schools, I don't think it's really an issue at all. I think that their athletics are fully integrated into academics without there being any problem. The really top flight NCAA athletic programs, I just wonder if there should be a lot more separation between the athletic programs and the academic programs, because in theory, you know, Ohio State's football program and its basketball program bring in money to the university through branding, through national exposure, through just the money they make through concessions and ticket sales. But at the same time, it's one of these other things that kind of draws attention away from what universities, I think, are supposed to do, which is instruct students. I mean, right now I'm teaching, kind of taking a break from teaching literature and just teaching first-year writing classes. And I do a lot of ethnography when I teach first-year writing. And so my first assignment for the class is, how did you end up at Ohio State? In other words, what motivated you to come here? And probably a third of the class said, I came because I love the football team. That's not a reason to go to college, I don't think, you know. I didn't tell them that directly. I didn't want to start off by, you know, repudiating their very first paper. So I went a little easy on them, you know, and corrected things like comma splices. But I thought that was a pretty horrifying answer for a third of the class. So I don't know what to make of athletics. I mean, I thought some people have floated the idea that universities should sponsor athletic teams and pay their players stipends and not pretend that they're student athletes when in a lot of cases they shouldn't be. I mean, you know, every year I'm always fascinated by where the NFL has its draft combine right before the draft, and one of the things that gets leaked repeatedly every year are the Wonderlic scores. They have to take this very short 50-minute intelligence test, and Andrew Luck got a 37, which is a respectable score, but on the low side for a quarterback from Stanford. You would have expected a little better. And some beacon of intelligence from LSU got a 4. I mean, I don't know, you know, I didn't think that was possible. And the way, you know, with the Wonderlic score, the way it works, you can actually translate it roughly to an IQ test or an IQ score. What you do is you take the Wonderlic score, you double it, and you add 60, and that's the person's IQ score. So 4 plus 4 is 8 plus 60, and this is a guy who was in college? That's pretty scary. And to make that, to translate that to the actual topic of my talk, rather than make this a sports show or something, there's a private college, Daymar College, which has campuses in Ohio and Kentucky, where the minimum Wonderlic score, they don't do the ACT or the SAT to get admissions. They give people the Wonderlic test. And the minimum Wonderlic test to get into Daymar College is a 10. So 10 plus 10 is 20 plus 60 is 80. So if you get an 80 on the Wonderlic test, you can get admitted to this for-profit college. What are your chances of graduating if you have basically an IQ of 80 and you're admitted to college? And so there, you know, and then once you're in there, your instructors are basically told by the administrators, do not let this person flunk out. Give them every possible chance in the world. And there's stories about people being coached through the test, and you get 3 chances to take it before, you know, you're deemed not college material. It's a very, you know, the for-profit industry is just so slimy, and I don't know, it'll take a lot more than just the depth of investigation that's taken place so far to really expose them for what they are. And when that happens, I think you're going to see a lot more migration to community colleges, which I think are a lot more responsible in the way they treat their students and the standards that they impose. That's why that's an area that I feel like I don't fully understand, but is really booming. And I think will continue to, because I don't see tuition at 4-year colleges leveling off, and community colleges are still affordable. So if you don't want to go into a massive amount of debt, that's the logical option for a lot of people. Yes?
I think one of your themes is the contrast between the institutions that have and the institutions that have not.
Right.
I think one example of this is there are some American universities that are essentially international brands that can establish outposts in other countries.
Yes.
On the other hand, what's to stop Ohio State or Wright State from outsourcing some of its online education and increasing that to sources in India and China and England, wherever?
They could. I mean, and that's what, you know, in Marty's introductory remarks, that's what a lot of the elite universities are doing. And they're doing it in a kind of teaser way, like you get to take a few online courses for free. You don't get any credit. You don't get anything like a degree from MIT. But then once you've taken a certain number of those free courses, well, then you get to go to a testing center and get a certificate, but you have to pay to do that. I don't think it'll ever get to the point where you'll be able to get an online degree from Harvard or MIT. But it's a money-making move, as far as I can tell. I don't think it's really an educational move. I think it's something designed to just to spread the brand or to capitalize on the brand. And I think that schools like Wright State or Ohio State could do that. I'm not quite sure what purpose it would serve.
No, I was saying that they would outsource, and instead of a professor of Wright State teaching, they would hire somebody in India or China or even England to offer the course.
I wonder if that could change things enormously, and that's a prospect that really frightens me, that there could be a real contraction in faculty if a scenario like that were to unfold. In other words, if a university were to decide, okay, we want somebody teaching an introduction to British literature, so let's just contract, pay Neil Ferguson a fixed amount to do it, and just basically not hire history professors anymore in that area. I mean, it would be a way of consolidating faculty by outsourcing faculty positions. You know, with the advent of things like Skype or the perfection of technologies like Skype, it would be very easy to do. And, you know, in his book, Shakespeare, Einstein, and the Bottom Line, David Kerp actually talks about small colleges that are doing that. Colleges that are small and have, they're especially doing it in departments that are relatively obscure, like archaeology, where they just don't have enough faculty to teach a variety of topics. They're kind of banding together and sharing faculty. Well, that's all well and good if it's done with good intent, but it could be done for financial purposes in a way that would be, I think, really dangerous, because it would make faculty more dispensable.
The one thing we haven't touched on is the administrative bloat. We hear all about the business model, but for the last 30 years, American business has been ruthlessly pruning out middle management.
Right.
And, you know, if you look at venture capitalists, Romney's group, that's what they do. They go into a company, and one of the ways they make it more profitable, that they drive the share price up, is pruning out all the middle
That's
management,
right.
the dead weight.
Yeah,
And yet, at American universities, we see this proliferation of administration.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so in a weird way, it's kind of like, well, we're stressing the business model for every other aspect of the university except for administrative costs.
Right. Yeah, that's a huge problem. I think we're doing the opposite of what the private sector is doing when it comes to that. Somewhere along the line, this is a debate Ohio State had about 10 years ago. They decided, well, what can we do to make Ohio State run more efficiently? And their conclusion was create another layer of deans. And that's what they did. So now we have not only deans, but executive deans. You know, it's just like, and we don't need that many people to run the university. I mean, we have too many. You know, so many, that many administrators is just, we have so many more than we did when I came there 23 years ago.
A couple of years ago, someone asked me how many people at Wright State I thought had vice president or provost in their title. And I said, well, I can think of 6 or 7, so I'm assuming it's about double that, like 14 or 15. And I was told at that time 34, and I think there's 37 now.
And it's sad that the generation of professors who really despised administrators are retiring. They really help. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the new professors, like the assistant professors that I know, they sort of take it for granted that this is the bureaucratic system that they just have to accept. Whereas, you know, I had a colleague who, one of his favorite jokes was a professor goes into a restaurant and, you know, and the 3 specials on the menu are assistant professor's brains, full professor's brains, and dean's brains. And the assistant professor's brains are $19.95, and the full professor's brains are $29.95, and then the dean's brains are $55.95, and then so the one of the people in the party orders the plate of dean's brains, and it's this tiny little portion, and whereas the assistant professor's brains are quite generous, and the guy complains, and the waiter says, "Well, but sir, do you realize how many deans we had to kill to get this report?" You know, there aren't people like that anymore. These people are retiring, the people who are kind of anti-administration. And you get these people right out of graduate school now, and they just figure, okay, this is what I have to do. You know, I've got a gun at my head. I have to write a monograph in 6 years, so I can't worry about how many administrators there are and why I should hate them. Whereas before, when you didn't have to write even a monograph to get tenure, you could figure out the institution and figure out when it was starting to get bloated and get mad about that. So
Well, maybe our union leadership just attracts.
there's a start, yeah. I
Angrier
think, yeah,
assistants
an angry
or
union would
associate
help.
professors.
Ohio State's not unionized, so.
What are the prospects for utilizing it at Ohio State?
I think they're really poor, you know, because Ohio State, if you think about it, Ohio State has so many people who have absolutely no incentive to unionize. The College of Agriculture, they make a fortune doing consulting for farms across the state. They make so much independent money. They have no incentive. The medical school, because there are so many specialists, they make a fortune, no incentive there. The law school also does a lot of consulting aside from their faculty. The business school, also a lot of consulting aside from, so there are just so many big components of the university that they would feel like they were taking a completely unwarranted risk to unionize. The only people who really have an incentive to unionize would be people in arts and sciences. And, you know, the faculty there is so huge that you need a critical mass in order to be able to make, say, AAUP a functional union rather than just an organization. I think AAUP membership at Ohio State is only around 400. So we're nowhere close to the numbers we'd need in order for it to work as a union. My biggest hope, I think, is that adjuncts might unionize because they're really, you know, especially in the last couple of years, given the financial hard times, they've been really at the mercy of the budget as set by the administrators. And they have to be getting really upset about the uncertainty of their employment status. If they were to unionize, they supply enough of the teaching workforce in departments like English, especially, because they teach so much first-year writing, that they could really grind a department like English to a halt if they unionized. So they have an incentive, but I don't think that so many of the faculty don't. English would, but English is just such a fraction of the people who teach there. Yes?
What's the reasoning behind most universities being, public universities being funded by the state? Just seem more, make more sense that it's funded by the federal government instead of California's growth.
Right. Yes, yeah.
Ohio doesn't really have that much either, but I know Wright State's trying to take some steps to keep funding.
Right, right.
And plus the benefits, you know, all the colleges in Ohio don't benefit Ohio, they benefit the whole country.
Yeah.
You know, being funded by the federal government might be able to curb that.
Well, I think that it would be great because it would even things out. I mean, some states are so poor that their universities are funded abysmally. You know, you go to the places like the Deep South and then states like Idaho, and there's nothing. And California, like you said, is broke. I mean, my personal California horror story is I spoke at Berkeley a year ago, and I was telling Marty about this earlier. I booked a flight to give my talk there, and they asked me to pay for it in advance, and they would reimburse me, and they gave me a check for reimbursement, and it bounced. It's the University of California, so this is Berkeley. They didn't have $250 in their bank account to pay for my airfare. So I'm not speaking in California anymore. And you know, I think that you're making a really good point. If there were federal funding for all universities, then it could be done on a much more level basis. But I don't see that there's I don't see the mood in the country for doing that. I don't think that enough people would want to say, okay, we want to make this a national priority. I wish people would, but I just don't see it, even though the funding inequities from one state to the next are vary quite widely. The only reason Ohio State's afloat is because of Gordon Gee, our university's president. Ohio State actually ranks 4th in the country among public and private universities in acquiring corporate donations. And that's the only thing that's keeping us from really economic carnage, that Gordon Gee is just such a great schmoozer that he's able to get these companies to just give us huge amounts of money. Problem with that is, once you're relying that much on corporate donations, those corporate donations are often earmarked. Like, he'll get a huge corporate donation, but the company will say, I want to give this money to the business school. The medical center at Ohio State, as of 2 months ago, became the Les Wexner Medical Center, because the biggest contributor to Ohio State for many years now has been the billionaire, probably, Les Wexner. So he must have given them an enormous amount of money, but it all went to the medical center. It didn't, there's never going to be, the so-and-so English department at Ohio State. I'm not waiting for that to happen. I think a federal model would be great. It's really a shame that the United States never adopted Thomas Jefferson's proposal 2 centuries ago to found a national university. I think we really missed the boat on that one, and I think it's too late to do so now. That would be something that would, I think, really galvanize the whole country in support of higher education. Jefferson pushed really hard for there to be a national university that would pick the best students from every socioeconomic class and educate them at government expense. And I think if you had that as a kind of unique model, then there would be more widespread support for federal support for higher education, and not this crazy voucher system where we have now, where we've got federal loans and a Byzantine financial aid system that involves the federal government, private institutions, private banks, federal loans, state scholarships. It's just such a mishmash. It's almost impossible for prospective college students to figure it all out. And it stays just as complicated when you apply to graduate school, too. That's an interesting point to raise. Things like that would go away, exactly, yeah. I mean, that never made any sense to me. Why, if you're from New York and you want to go to school at Wright State, that you have to suddenly pay 4 times as much. You should be able to go to any university in the country and pay a uniform tuition. And if the funding were all coming from the federal government, I assume that would happen. That's a good point. Yes?
Well, what kind of future would you see for Wright State? Do you want to speculate on that?
I'm not really sure. I mean, it seems to me that Wright State is going to be in the same kind of position between a rock and a hard place that all state universities are, because you can't be getting very much funding from the state of Ohio. You're probably not getting anywhere near the kind of research dollars that flagship state universities do. So it just makes things really difficult. I don't know what your tuition situation has been, but you have to just kind of scramble for sources of money, and that makes it just all the more difficult, I think. Even though you're serving a student population where there aren't many other options, right? I mean, in this region, as far as public universities, there's Wright State and there's University of Cincinnati, and other than that, you're looking at, as far as I understand, mostly private colleges and universities. So there has to be some public option, but I don't know exactly, it's very hard to predict the fate of individual institutions. So, yes? Yeah.
And I see all of the, especially in public institutions as well, that it seems as though that given the sort of corporate kind of structure,
Well, I think that the Ivy League schools will eventually be the Alamo for the humanities. I think that, I can foresee a time, maybe 20, maybe 30 years from now, where there won't be English departments at places like Wright State or Ohio State. There'll be departments of communications and culture. And, if Wright State works the way Ohio State does, once a department is done away with, then the tenured faculty in that department no longer have tenure. And, usually a university, when that happens, like Ohio State eliminated a department of photography several years ago, but it made a good faith effort to place the people in photography in other departments. So they're not like setting people adrift. But if that were to happen, then that would represent an incredible shrinking of the humanities and an expansion of other parts of the university that reflect the corporate interests that universities increasingly seem to like. And so I'm honestly surprised that that hasn't happened to some long-standing traditional disciplines. Like, it amazes me that there are still departments of classics. Because one of the statistics I cite in my book is that right now, there are 6 classics professors in the United States for every 1 classics major. So how do these departments survive? Eventually I think the universities are going to say, these departments aren't pulling their weight. They need to be phased out. And if you look at New York, another very poor university system, they did away with their Slavic languages department and with a couple of other departments as well. They just abolished them. I wrote a blog post about it, and one of the comments I got, this is for the Chronicle of Higher Education, one of the comments I got back was, well, I don't care if Slavic languages is abolished at every university in the country. The only languages we should be teaching are Chinese and Spanish, because those are the only ones that have commercial value. Well, okay. I mean, there are hardliners out there who just really wouldn't care if the curriculum and the course offerings and the number of departments at universities were really shaved down to what mattered practically. That's a very frightening prospect to me. I don't think it would happen to a department like English for a long time, and I don't think departments like classics and like Slavic languages would go away at universities like Harvard or Stanford for a long time, because they can afford to support them, even though there isn't that much student interest, because they can afford to maintain something like the complete liberal arts curriculum and boast that they still can do that. But for state universities that are financially strapped, it gets harder and harder to justify.
The Slavic languages thing is actually tied to the military budget. I mean, as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed,
Right, exactly.
all the Slavic
Right.
studies departments collapsed.
Right,
The
right,
enrollments in them
right.
collapsed.
They had practical value for the duration of the Cold War, and now, in the minds of some people, they don't. Yeah. Yes?
It's not just the humanities that find themselves in a difficult position to justify themselves financially. Not the top universities, not the top public universities. Lab sciences and engineering are financially strapped.
Right.
They cost much more than they bring in tuition.
Right. And so, depending on the university, if they can't generate enough soft money, then they become a liability to the university. I mean, it's true, certainly. I have a good friend in chemistry at Ohio State, and he was told basically when he was hired, you have to bring in this much amount of money in grants or you will not get tenure, because your lab costs more than what we're paying you in salary, and so you have to make up the difference. And so, yeah, it extends beyond the humanities, I think. And I think that, I don't know what it'll mean headed into the future. Most of my book is about just the erosion of tenure and the way that, because the biggest component of any university's budget is its labor force. And if you can kind of basically, to put it in factory terms, if you can take people off the assembly line and basically take people off very owners would see as cushy jobs with benefits and retirement packages and pensions, et cetera, and replace them with people that you can replace them with on-demand workers, with perma-temp workers, then that's the way you're going to save the most amount of money. If you don't want to cut administration, if you don't want to cut physical plant, that's the way you do it. And I think that the way universities can do that most subtly is when faculty retire, don't replace them. It used to be the case at Ohio State that anytime somebody in 18th century studies retired, that person would be replaced with somebody else who taught 18th century studies. Now, as of about 15 years ago, we got a dean who said, there are no lines, faculty lines, there's just money. And that resulted in a very different way of thinking about how money on faculty hiring is spent. And, you know, it's going to result eventually in, I think, fewer tenure track lines. And I think that's going to happen nationwide. And at some universities, it's going to happen faster than others. It's just a cheaper way of doing business. And once you kind of capitulate to the idea that the institution you're running, and if you're a university president or a provost, is a business, then you're going to look for ways to make money or save money.
That does contradict the whole prestige notion, though, that you're going after. I mean, if you aren't doing research, you're not doing publications, how is the prestige of the institution measured?
That's true, yeah. I think that, and that's why the elite universities have such a big advantage. But I think there are going to be fewer and fewer of them headed into the future as well. Because, you know, I really am a big fan of Robert Frank's theory about a winner-take-all market, that really, once you start down the road of the prestige race, only one institution is going to win. And not necessarily just one, but there'll be very few institutions that will be at the very top of the heap, and that will be it. And public institutions will not be able to compete in that race. And because they just don't, they can't be selective, they don't have the financial resources, so that hurts them. And, you know, so they're sort of at a huge disadvantage from the start. But then again, you know, there are a lot of private universities, elite private universities that employ an enormous number of adjuncts. Harvard employs 45% of the teaching workforce at Harvard are adjuncts. There's a great article by this woman named Mickey McGee, in which she taught at least, this came out in Social Tech several years ago, so I don't know where she is now, but she taught as an adjunct at New York University. And she quoted material from New York University's handbook for adjuncts. And one of the things they're explicitly told is, do not reveal your rank to your students. Because these students at New York University are paying $40,000 a year. They think they're being taught by world-class faculty, but in fact they're being taught by somebody who's making probably about, in New York at NYU, I would guess probably about $8,000 a course. They're not being taught by somebody who's doing a lot of publishing. They're not being taught by somebody who is a public intellectual or a renowned scholar. They're being taught by an adjunct, by somebody who, in her case, didn't even have a PhD. But she's not allowed to tell them what her status is. She's told, be upbeat at all times and dodge that question. And you got to figure that the adjuncts at Harvard are being told the same thing. Other universities, elite universities, don't use many adjuncts at all. Stanford uses 6%. So it varies from university to university. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. Some elite universities use very few, some use a lot. But in the end, they're all expected to maintain this solid facade that the university's reputation for being prestigious cannot be compromised under any circumstances.
If there are no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.